Amalienborg, the home of our Queen Margaret II, and every day at 12 o'clock they actually do a march from the barracks, the Queen's soldiers, up to here where they do the change of the guards. So if you can hear a little music, that's because the royal guards, they are approaching. And what is it about Denmark and the royal family? Well, we are actually said to be the oldest monarchy in the Western world. And we say that our current royal family can trace their ancestors all the way back to the Viking Age, where the first king was Gorm the Old. And his son will probably sound very familiar because his name was Harold Bluetooth. And if you look at the logo on your smartphone, the Bluetooth logo is actually his initials, H and B, because he was an excellent communicator. The last 19 kings have either had the name Christian or Frederick, Christian Frederick, Christian Frederick. They're not so creative, but right now we have a queen, and that is Margaret II. She became queen because her parents did not get any boys, so they actually changed the law so that we could have a queen. And she is 80 years old. And she's still in very good shape, and she's extremely popular. She lives in the mansion here right behind me, and she's actually home today because you can see the flag is up. And right next door we have another mansion. There her oldest son lives. His name is of course Frederick. And we are in an area of Copenhagen called Frederiksstaden, which is a very magnificent area in Copenhagen. But now the royal guards are here. Let's have a look when they're coming. have come to another place here in Frederikshavn, close to where the Queen has her residence. And this is actually the Design Museum that I'm standing right in front of. It has not always been the Design Museum. It was actually established to be the very first hospital that we have in Copenhagen. It was established in 1757 by a king called Frederick V. You can see his monogram, and it was also named after him. It was called Frederick's Hospital. It is incredible to think about that it was the first hospital, and it was the only hospital for about 70,000 Copenhageners. And of course it was only for the wealthy people in Copenhagen. So who worked here? Well, in the beginning, you didn't have an education to be a nurse, for instance. The women that would take those tasks, it would be widows very often, and they had to work very hard. The only demands there was to the nurses was that they could be sober, that they were able to read for the patients and so on, but very often they got drunk anyway. Later on, we got Theodor Fliesner in Kaiserwerth in Germany. He was the first one to really establish an education as a nurse. This is where Florence Nightingale went to learn about to be a nurse. But a little before, actually in 1854, we had our very own Florence Nightingale. Her name was Ilja Fibiger, and she was a young woman who had read Søren Kierkegaard. And she was very inspired. She wanted to sacrifice herself. She wanted to help people. So she applied here to work to help the sick and the poor. So why would they begin to make hospitals? Well, it was also because of the economy. Now people could actually see that if we can keep people alive, we can use them to work. It's actually good to try to help people to get healthy. So that was an explanation. Very short after they established Frederiks Hospital, they also made another hospital that was meant to be for the more poor people. So another story I want to tell you here is also about Struensee, the German physician that we heard about earlier. He got the idea that they should put up a box right here next to Frederiks Hospital, where women could deliver their small babies if they had got pregnant without being married. And that is actually leading to our next stop, because we're going to the birth center in Copenhagen. I just told you about Struensee, who put up a box in front of the General Hospital so young women that had gotten pregnant without being married could come and deliver their babies. But the court surrounding him didn't like the idea. They thought it would actually encourage people to have sex without being married. But however, the authorities could see that it was necessary to do something for the young women who got pregnant without being married. So they established a birth center right here next to the hospital. And here all the medicine students could come and learn about delivering children. And you could say that they had a lot of issues. They had problems because they struggled with maternity fever from time to time in the 1800s. And in 1848, there is a professor here at the birth center. His name is Carl Levy. And he receives a letter from a colleague in Vienna. He tells him about a Hungarian doctor, Ignaz Semmelweis, who have made this huge discovery that you should just wash your hands. Very often the students would come directly from a dissection in the morning and then go and examine these women who were giving birth. So when Carl Levy reads about that you should just wash your hands and then the death rate will go down, well, he takes a deep breath. He stands up and then he writes a 20-page article against Semmelweis, because never have he heard something so stupid, and he doesn't believe in the idea at all. And actually that was quite common. Ignaz Semmelweis didn't get any acknowledged in his own time, but today we are very happy that we know we should wash our hands. We have now reached Castle Island. It's an amazing island here in Copenhagen. This is where Parliament is located, Supreme Court, but also this amazing museum called Thorvaldsens Museum. Thorvaldsen, we saw him earlier on the tour in the cathedral. This famous sculpture has his very own museum right here. And one of the sculptures is a portrait of the British author Lord Byron. And Lord Byron was one of the many authors and art people that considered tuberculosis to be a very romantic disease. You would be all pale and skinny, and Lord Byron actually hoped that he would die from tuberculosis or at least get ill, because he believed that all women would then fall for him. And Hans Christian Andersen, our own fairy tale writer, he said that Thorvaldsen had told him that when he was going to make this sculpture, he looked very, very serious. And Thorvaldsen said to Byron, "Oh, don't look so serious, look natural." And he would look at him and said, "But this is my nature." And all this thing about tuberculosis, of course, changed, because it is an old, ancient disease. And during the industrialization, it really had a huge outbreak all over Europe. You believe that actually 1/4 death in Europe was caused by tuberculosis. And if you are in your mid-40s, you might have a scar like myself here. It's the Calmette vaccine. And actually, it was in 1882 that Robert Koch discovered that tuberculosis was caused by a bacteria. The microscopes that back then had developed, so now you could actually see it with your own eyes. And from then on, research really exploded. And Peter Panum, he returned from Kiel, he came to Copenhagen, got his very own lab, and now the development really goes very fast. Reached the island that we call Castle Island. And on this island, all powerful people have been all the way back since Absalon. We actually have the remains of his very first fortress under the castle that you see today. The palace today is actually the 7th palace on this location, and everything that you see to the right is actually our parliament, and everything to the left is where the Queen, she has her reception rooms. And as you can see, there is also a riding ground complex where the Queen's horses are rehearsing on a daily basis. The beautiful white buildings that you can see here is actually the only remains we have from what we call the first Christiansborg. It was one of the most stunning palaces we've ever had in Denmark, but unfortunately it was only here for a very short time, about 50 years, then it burned down. So this is the only things we have left, and it was actually established to be stables, and it still is for the about 13 horses that lives on this island. But there's also another interesting thing here next to the riding ground complex. It's the court theatre, and that's where we're going now. As you heard earlier on the tour, we have a lot of Christians and Frederiks in the line of kings in Denmark. But one of them, his name was Christian VII, and he was actually mentally ill. Today we believe that he had schizophrenia. And one of his absolute favorite places in town was this place right behind me. It's the court theatre. And he loved the theatre. And he loved it so much, so sometimes when he came here to watch a performance, he would actually jump up on the stage and thought he was one of the actors and so on. And he was really embarrassing. Walked around in the streets of Copenhagen with a prostitute called Booty Catherine, went into bars and started fights and so on. So one of the things they did to sort of help him was to give him a physician. His name was Johann Friedrich Struensee. He was German. And he came here to help him. Christian VII was married to a British lady called Caroline Mathilde. And together they had a son, Frederick. And when Struensee arrived, he actually interfered in how this little boy should be raised. You have to think about that we are in the age of enlightenment. A lot of new modern ideas are spreading in Europe, and especially a guy called Rousseau makes a book about how to raise children in a more natural way. So Struensee actually interfered. He said that the little crown prince should be more independent. He should play with young children in his own age, from another background, from the countryside, and so on. And Caroline Mathilde and Struensee actually developed a very close friendship. They were both interested in those ideas about enlightenment. And it was very interesting ideas. It was not only about raising children in a more natural way, it was about giving people freedom of speech, freedom of press, about abandoning torture, and so on. And the friendship developed, and actually they became lovers behind the king's back. But in the middle of all this royal affair, we have a lot of we also have diseases, and one of the most feared diseases in the end of the 1700s was smallpox or variola. And there was an outbreak here in Copenhagen. So Struensee, he actually inoculated the little crown prince. And that was the first sort of vaccines that you would try to do. That was in 1770. It is also in the late 1700s that Edward Jenner discovers that the milkmaids in his area, they have blisters from smallpox, but they don't get really sick. So he got the idea that if you get the disease a little, then you will be immune. And that was actually a huge progress in medical history, because it is actually the biggest progress since medieval times, that you could begin to vaccine the population. And in Denmark, it became mandatory. Well, they couldn't force people to get the vaccine, but they could say, you can't get married, you can't get your confirmation, you can't do military service, you can't go to school. So in a way, they did force people to get the vaccine. And actually, it was the little crown prince that I talked about before that made this law when he later on became the king, Frederick VI. Right behind me, we have one of the sort of hidden gems in Copenhagen. It's the Royal Library Garden. It has not always been a garden, because back in the days it was actually a naval port established by one of our most famous kings called Christian IV. And from this port he could send out ships into the world. And one of our favorite stories is a Norwegian sailor called Jens Munk. He was sent out to find a new way to China, and they thought that they could go north of America. Super bad idea. When they reached Hudson Bay, they discovered that it was more cold than they could ever imagine, and they just died one by one. Not only just from the cold, but also because of scurvy. And scurvy, this C vitamin deficiency disease, was also known as the plague of the ocean. And we believe that about 2 million people have died from this disease, which was a huge mystery. People couldn't understand why they would get ill. It's a terrible disease that will give you anemia. It will make your gums alterate so the teeth falls out, and It takes about 2 to 3 months before you don't have any C vitamin left in your body if you haven't eaten it. And the reason why we tell this story on the tour is because it's actually also a huge change in history, because James Lind, a Scottish doctor who was on a ship, he made the first clinical trial on a ship because he had a suspicion that it might have something to do with the C vitamin. So he took 12 men who were ill and did the same thing with all these 12 men and wrote everything down. And 2 of the men, they got oranges and lemons, and after a very short time they recovered, they got healthy, so he could prove that this has something to do with deficiency of C vitamin. But it took a long time before it was recognized by the sort of snobbish people in the British Army. But when they finally accepted it, it was a huge change in history. So what happened with our Norwegian sailor Jens Munk? Well, actually, he survived. There was only him and 2 of his sailors left. He had already written a letter saying, "I'm going to die, this was a huge failure." But then spring came, and he actually managed to get 1 out of 2 ships ready so he could cross the Atlantic in a terrible weather and come back to Scandinavia. When he finally made his way back to Copenhagen, he discovered that his wife had married somebody else. We stand right next to the Canal of Copenhagen, and it's the final stop on the tour about medical history. So in the year 1800, the average life expectancy was only 40 years. And 100 years after, in 1900, it has increased to 55 years. So a lot of things is happening in the end of the 1800s. For instance, in 1846, you can actually sedate your patients. You can give them chloroform or ether, and that's a huge progress, because now you don't need people to hold your patients while you make an operation. So the doctors didn't have to be so fast. They actually had peace to do the things that they needed to do. Later on, we have the focus on hygiene, that you should actually wash your hands. We heard that earlier on the tour about Semmelweis, also a huge progress. We begin to get the X-rays. Now you can see if there's fractures, where are they, and so on. Huge progress. But the biggest progress was, of course, Alexander Fleming, who in 1928 discovered the antibiotics. And you probably know the story. He went on vacation, he came back and discovered that there was mold in one of his petri dishes. A huge progress in medical history. And where are we now in 2021? Well, a pandemic has been in the world, and everything has stopped. But of course, we have come very, very far. But still, we will probably look back in 100 years and look on the ways we for instance, treated cancer patients and wonder, because there is a lot of mysteries to be solved still. It could be intestinal diseases, it could be autoimmune systems like sclerosis. There's a lot of things to discover still.